My name is Lisa Naqvi, and this is the sixth episode of the Little Book Company podcast. Today I'm talking to Bina Shah, novelist, essayist, op-ed writer, blogger. Her collection of short stories, The Fruits of Our Unlabor, has been recently published by the Little Book Company as an ebook. Welcome, Bina.
Hi, Manisa. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. It's my honor.
You described me as a blogger, but I think I should tell you that I think blogging is dead. And I say that because I no longer have any desire to write on my own blog. So I am declaring blogger as to be struck out from my bio from now on.
I would agree. And you were wondering I was wondering where we should start our conversation. So let's start it right there. You no longer are blogging, but what are you doing on social media?
Well, it's been a rough ride, actually, because I was blogging and I was tweeting the most. So those were my two most, I would say, prolific outputs. And then it seemed that Twitter was going to an early grave when Elon Musk bought it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't know what to do because, he changed everything, the algorithm. He introduced an algorithm that prioritized people who had paid for blue check marks. The blue check mark, the verification mark that I had gotten previously was taken away. Suddenly my tweets were not reaching the audience that they used to. A lot of people left Twitter. So I was adrift for some time, I think about 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that it would be a good time to just take a break from Twitter and see what happens after 6 months. I signed up for every single other sort of Twitter substitute, but never really got used to any of them. So now I'm sort of sporadically on and off Twitter, but it's not anymore a place for what I would call meaningful conversation or meaningful idea generation. The same thing happened with blogging. I think blogs just also died. They just died off, and I don't know what exactly made them go the way of the dinosaurs, but it's not about blogging anymore. And that was really the big thing for a good, I would say, 20 years from the beginning of the internet going to a wide audience worldwide.
Mm-hmm. I understand that because I was writing a column for threequartsdaily.com's Monday column, and
Yes.
essays for that blog, a wonderful eclectic blog, and really put a lot of thought and time into those essays. But then I found that I was putting all my energy and ideas into those essays instead of focusing on a novel or some other form of writing. Do you find that with your social media interaction with Twitter now, or that takes away from your writing at all?
No, not at all. I had the opposite experience. I found that when I tweeted, it would sort of set off these creative sparks in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I would then find inspiration to write longer pieces or op-eds or whatever. So I enjoyed that process. And I also tend to be, I'm very careful to save what I do so that I can repurpose it later. So if there's an idea that I've had just in an off-the-cuff comment on Twitter, I often go back to it and then think about how I can develop it into a larger piece of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I do the same thing with a lot of the talks that I give. I try to turn them into essays. I've done that with interviews that I've held with writers during Karachi Literature Festival. Those also turn into essays. So I sort of squirrel away what I do in my more casual moments and see if they work for the more purposeful writing.
Wonderful. In my own head, when I write, I might be doing the same thing I kind of see it like jars of spices sitting on a shelf that I've filed,
Mhm.
and then I use them as needed, as ideas that I pour into my novels and my writing. I think it might be a similar process.
Well, I think it just speaks to the bigger picture of a writer's life, because you think, or people who don't write think that the writing starts when you sit down in front of the laptop or
Mhm.
the typewriter, and it ends when you get up from the desk and go away. But it actually doesn't. I'm sure you have the same experience. The writing goes on all the time in your head. When you're on the phone, when you're eating your breakfast, you're taking a shower, the ideas are just going, the words are going. And sometimes you actually have to leave what you're doing to get it down on paper. So, I think that everything that we're doing contributes to what's going on in our imaginations and in our creative subconscious and unconscious. And we have to be quite aware when we see something flitting past, and pin it down, I think, and then maybe work on it later.
Yeah, agreed. And so, shall we? Your latest book is Monsoon Wars, and your latest novel. And is it a sequel to your fifth novel, Before She Sleeps, which is a feminist dystopian novel? At least it's described that way. I've read it, and I would say yes. I would say that's what it is.
Yes, absolutely. It is absolutely the sequel to Before She Sleeps. The Monsoon War also works as a standalone novel, and I think that anybody who reads The Monsoon War will then go on to probably read Before She Sleeps to catch up on what they missed.
Okay, well, I haven't read it yet, and I'm looking forward to reading Monsoon War. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so Before She Sleeps was a feminist dystopia. I didn't give it that classification. Reviewers and critics did, because there was a wave of books that came out around 2018 that seemed to be dealing with the same themes of patriarchy as a dystopian construct, and women resisting that patriarchy as a type of science fiction premise, in the way that so many science fiction stories have been resistance tales. For example, Dune, for example, Star Wars, so on and so forth. So Before She Sleeps was sort of seen as a crop of these new feminist dystopias coming up, inspired in some way by Margaret Atwood's original feminist dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale. Actually, when I did some research for myself, it wasn't only Margaret Atwood that had been writing feminist dystopia. There had been feminist dystopias popping up everywhere, but they just weren't called that. So Before She Sleeps is that kind of book. But it takes place in an urban setting, in a very noir kind of setting at night. And it's, the imagery and the aesthetic is very dark. There's no light. It's about sleep. It's got to do with being unconscious on different levels. The Monsoon War, on the other hand, is about awakening. It's about a sunrise, a new day that dawns when this terrible dark night is over, and then this new day brings hope, and it brings action and a lot of adventure, and it's very daylight based and very sunlight based, is how I can best describe it without actually going into a lot of plot details.
No, you don't need to do that because I think it's such an interesting. The name is so interesting, and the idea is so interesting that I'm going to start reading it tonight. That's for sure.
Oh, yay. Thank you. Well, yeah, so the Monsoon War is pretty much the continuation of the conditions that I set up in Before She Sleeps, but I shift focus to a different setting, to a mountainous region. And mountainous regions are remote often, and they are great places for resistance movements to take seed. And this book is about one particular resistance movement that is only made up of women. And I
Mhm.
was very inspired inspired by some of the female resistance fighters, the Kurdish fighters in Syria and Iraq who had fought against IS, Islamic State. And there was a lot of media attention to how beautiful these women were and what an amazing thing it was that they were actually fighting against brown men and killing them and so on and so forth, which is a very, imperialist way of looking at that phenomenon. So I stripped it back and I took out all the racist, I guess the racist Eurocentric and Western-centric eye, and just situate the reader right in the middle of that action so you see what it's like to actually be one of those soldiers fighting in this resistance.
So is it actually, do you name it as Syria and...
No. That was the inspiration, but this is a time period in the future where those countries don't exist under those names anymore. They've been renamed. They have, and they have been grouped into larger territorial, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of alliances is what I would say. Sort of future casting what the Middle East might look like post Gaza, post an apocalyptic type of war. So there's a lot of geopolitics in it as well.
Would you say it's prescient?
I'm not going to say that because I really wouldn't like this kind of future to come true, but it's just one of many possibilities.
And what about A Season for Martyrs, which was your fourth novel? So that's
not science fiction.
Not science fiction, not science fiction, and set in Sindh.
Yes, so that was more historical fiction combined with contemporary fiction to tell a history of Sindh through the eyes of its Sindhi population, Sindhi inhabitants, and the rich history, culture, traditions, myths that go into 1,000 years of this province, which I thought was fascinating and had never been recounted in English, in the English language before.
And again, focused on women.
No, that wasn't solely focused on women. That had a mix, I would say. That had a mix. The protagonist is a male.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about it?
It's been a long time since I wrote that book, to be honest. And I'm thinking so much these days about Gaza, and I'm thinking so much these days about the artistic response to this war. So I'd have to dust off quite a few mental cobwebs to go back in time to what I was thinking and feeling when I wrote that article. But it's interesting because it was set in 2007, right before the time period where the 2008 elections were supposed to take place. And we recently just had elections again in 2024. So it was interesting for me to see what happened in this election versus what happened in that election. And I think we had another couple of elections in between as well. So you can sort of measure the progress of the country by where it was when I wrote A Season for Martyrs and where it is now. And the answer is not too far from where we were in 2007.
And you recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which you write for.
That's right.
From time to time, and it was focused on the election, this particular election on February 8th, 2024.
That's right.
And you came out in that article with a very hopeful sort of, I felt, note that no matter what, you were going to go and vote. You were going to go exercise your vote.
Yes, but it wasn't with a feeling of optimism. It was with a feeling of futility. I'm going to vote, but so what? What difference is it going to make? And that was pretty prescient because we had an election, but we didn't vote for these people.
That's true. So I wonder if we should Don't you think there's a hopeful note there as well, that people really organized themselves and exercised their vote and did not they did come out in large numbers, and despite all the obstacles in their way, including in terms of symbols, etc., they still managed to vote as a bloc.
Yes, but you know, there is such a thing as a symbolic and empty gestures, you know? So I look at it in terms of that article that I wrote wasn't just about this election, it was about the whole checkered history that Pakistan has had with democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that democracy has not served us well, even though we were sold these visions, this picture of bright and shining democracy from America, from Western countries, and we should learn from that and we should adopt that as our political model. And what happened in this country was far different in terms of we adopted a kind of a democracy that ticked all the boxes for the countries that made our foreign aid contingent upon free and fair elections, but we did it in our own inimitable style, which was not free and fair in any shape or form.
So, what are you saying, Bina?
I'm saying that I'm not that hopeful and I'm not that excited. In fact, I'm saying I'm feeling rather jaded about the whole democracy thing. And I think we're seeing in every other country where there are elections, we're seeing some real tests of that system, no less in the United States, where here are two very old candidates who are going to have a battle against each other. And it's just not inspiring anybody.
That's right. So it seems like there seems to be a capture, in my view, of democracy. And it's not that democracy doesn't work, but the way democracy has been um, manipulated and eroded has us in this very difficult situation globally.
Well, it's that democracy has actually been manipulated, eroded. It has actually been used to bring about the very opposite of democracy, which is a sort of authoritarianism and a kind of a resurgence of fascism, in a way. But these people have all used the tools of democracy to actually dismantle it, or at least that's what they're trying to do. So you got to say at some point, what's wrong with this system that we have held up as the example for so many decades, centuries, since the French Revolution, since the American Revolution? How has it suddenly, or not so suddenly, how have we ceded ground to the very people that we thought democracy would keep away from leadership positions? So I think that it's got a lot to do with the marriage of democracy and modern capitalism, because capitalism, I think, is a system that is just rapacious. It just swallows everything in its path. And the minute you make democracy beholden to capitalism in terms of money for campaigns, big donations, so on and so forth, that's it. You've declared that elections can be bought. Elections can go to the highest bidder. So some very deep thinking is necessary.
Definitely, there needs to be some not only deep thinking on where we go, but also I think we have to realize that the narrative that everyone has been fed, that other places have something called democracy, needs to be revisited, because in the United States, it wasn't until about 1920 that women got the vote, and it wasn't until in the 60s that African Americans got the vote. And the Jim Crow laws have been well and alive in the United States almost to this day, if you look at the prison system, etc. So the systems that are in place, and then France as well, in who it chooses um, to be its citizens and who actually does have who is really empowered with the vote. These are these are narratives that do need to be revisited, because in the end these are colonial powers, and they continue to thrive on that. So that system, I agree with you, can't be just shoved down the throats of all the countries of the world. However, don't you agree that it's the only viable system? Everything else, all the alternatives are bad.
No, I don't agree with that at all. And I would say that if you think that way, then you've already sort of shut down any kind of rethinking that you could do about how are we supposed to structure our societies. I don't think that we want to start the debate about democracy by saying, well, democracy is the only option, so it has to be, we have to fix it. No, you have to look at other places that are functioning and achieving economic targets and social targets and so on and so forth. And they don't maybe have a democratic system. For example, you've got Nordic countries which have a strong element of socialism in their democracy. Mm-hmm. And that is so, it's so strengthening for their people who don't have to worry about things that you have to worry about in the United States. For example, they have universal health care, they have social security benefits, much more wide ranging. And those principles come from socialism, not democracy as such. Then you have to look at places that are doing interesting things. For example, some of the Middle Eastern countries where they have these monarchies, and you've got, yes, oh, they were known for repression, human rights, so on and so forth. But then you've got somebody like Saudi Arabia where they're modernizing so rapidly, and that's because there is one ruler who has the vision and doesn't have to face the opposition for it. And that is a very effective way of getting reforms passed and opening up the country to all sorts of trade and investment opportunities. So you have to look at every country and say, what is it that's working for them? And is that directly linked to democracy, or is that directly linked to something else? And that's when you start understanding where democracy has fallen behind. For example, I read a review of a book by a French writer called Emmanuel Todd. I've forgotten the name of the book, but I do remember his name. And he said that the United States is going to be in a decline now. And what metric did he use to measure that decline? He looked at maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates. And he saw that today the United States infant mortality rate and maternal mortality rate, I think, is higher than both that of Japan, highly developed, and Russia. So Russia and Japan both have better maternal survival rates than the United States, the big democracy. So what are we saying democracy can do that it really can't do? And how do we fix that? I don't mean that any country should suddenly switch its political system. That's just illogical and impractical. But I think we have to sort of erase the blind spots that we've been going on for so long, the mistaken idea that democracy is the superior choice, the more moral choice, the ethical choice. It's not. You can use democracy to justify all sorts of unethical decisions and moves and policy decisions and so on and so forth. I mean, people can vote a Nazi into a position of power, and it's a democratic election. So you really have to look at what are we expecting out of democracy? Are we really being realistic about what it can get to us? And if not, then what changes do we make and how?
This is really very interesting, and I don't want it to turn into a debate with you. because I think there's a lot to unpack in what you said.
Yeah, I know. I just threw a lot of stuff at you. I'm sorry.
But just to, before we move on, just want to say that in the United States, it can't be called a democracy if there's an electoral college that finally decides on who will be the president, and the one person, one vote falls to the side, and states with hardly anybody in them get equal number of senators as do states that are as gigantic with the population of 50 million, like California or New York, and those sorts of imbalances tend to favor one ethnicity, basically white citizens of the United States. And when you don't have one vote, one person system, then you do have to question democracy and how there can be an enormous capture of that democracy. Um, but uh, but your ideas are interesting, and I wish we could talk about. We might take those up, huh, Bina, in another podcast.
Sure. I just want to say, sort of in closing, it hasn't been one person, one vote since ancient Greece. That's when it was one person, one vote. And even then, there were limitations on who that one person was. It had to be a man, it had to be a free man, it had to be somebody of a certain standing, right? And then as democracy started to evolve, then it started to be not just extending the vote to women and extending the vote to African Americans or whomever, but it was also about changing from a direct democracy to a representative democracy, representational democracy, which is what you have now with the Electoral College. So I think the important area where there's good work going on, interesting work going on, is in the area of democratic reform and electoral reform, which I know people are working on in the United States, and we'll see what evolves from that.
And I wonder if there's a way to connect the electoral college system in the United States to the fact that in Pakistan we have, what is referred to as when candidates are chosen by parties, it's on the basis of their voting banks, their voter banks, because large landholders who have tenant farmers who are beholden to them, and they vote in the way that they're asked to, ordered to vote, etc., etc. So that may be, one of the pitfalls in.
So, I hear this a lot, but I have to say that in 2024, it doesn't really work like that anymore in Pakistan. And we actually have, so just to backtrack a little bit, so we have an even weirder form of democracy, which is parliamentary democracy. And again, it's supposed to be a system by which the people elect their representatives. And of course, as you point out so rightly, that when there are people who are disadvantaged in terms of education, money, land holding power, how can they be anything but coerced to choose the person that will intimidate them to vote for them, But I would say that in 2024, a lot of rural people in Sindh, especially, I know Sindh better than any of the other provinces, but in Sindh, people are really picking up the vote for themselves. They're voting for people and for parties because they do directly feel that there has been benefit to them in their individual lives. And they do feel that if they give the vote to this certain person, he will be able to, or she will be able to directly benefit the area in which they live. And so it's a very transactional kind of voting. It is not, I'm sorry.
Which is good.
Yes, but people haven't recognized that this is happening. People still think it's the feudals and they're putting guns to these poor people's heads and forcing them to vote for them. It's not like that anymore. People have become extremely smart. Social media has changed everything. TikTok has changed everything. The fact that this is a young population now with a youth bulge that is hungry for information and also now starts to believe that they have an individual voice that they can raise when they want to point out injustice. I mean, these are hugely, hugely powerful changes. Social changes, sociocultural changes, sociocultural political changes that really are far more powerful and should be studied in depth. They're far more powerful than which government, which party is holding the reins of power in Islamabad. What's happening at the grassroots level and what's happening at the provincial level is so important and so interesting. We're going to see its effects in the next 50 to 100 years.
Well, there is one thing that there are, the constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, did devolve powers to the provinces, and then those flowed down to the local levels and the union levels, and that decides, where the budget envelope is. And people have been choosing their representatives, people who they're going to elect based on knowing whether this guy or gal can get the job done in terms of getting, funds for much needed infrastructure or other projects in their own, councils. So that has been a very powerful.
Yes, and it's had a trickle up effect on the people that are running for office, because now they're suddenly waking up to the realization that they actually have to serve the people. They actually have to answer to the people if they want to continue to be elected. It's no longer a given that just because you're the feudal landlord of this area, you're going to be the MNA as well, and the MPA and your son. Now it's very much a balancing act. I will say also that devolution has, on the whole, it's put things in a good direction, but there have been a lot of problems and obstacles and hang-ups between how exactly do powers get devolved from the federal to the provincial and the local bodies. Some places it's been very unclear. Some places things are being held back. In some places, the federal division doesn't have any communication with the provincial division, so nobody knows really what's going on, and lots of money falls through those cracks. So there's still a lot of work to be done on cleaning this whole system up.
I see these all as very. This is progress in our democracy that is taking place.
100%, 100%.
So, Bina, can we talk about Slum Child, your third novel?
Oh my God, why are we going backwards, Manisa?
I don't know.
Okay, Slum Child, which was written in 2010 or 2010, I think. Yes. Yeah, that's right. That is a very early novel of mine now, when I look back. And it was the story of a small girl called Leila, who's a part of the minority community of Christians growing up and living in Karachi. And I was very interested at the time in interfaith relations and how we were assuming that because we are Muslim, the vast majority of us are Muslim, that automatically that meant our minorities were being well treated. And I wanted to show that that was not the case at all, which was kind of a bold thing to do back then, but I did it.
And we are going to take a pause here, but when we come back, we're going to pick up right where we left off and talk about minorities. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll be right back. You're talking about your third novel, Slum Child, and the fact that the main character in it is Christian.
Yes, that's right. A Christian girl in a Christian slum.
In a Christian slum in Karachi.
That's right.
And you're highlighting the the trials of minorities in Pakistan through this novel, among other
Well,
things.
what I really wanted to do with this novel was sort of get at the idea of, well, these days we're very well versed with the notion of white privilege, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Pakistan, we have different kinds of privilege. There's Sunni privilege, there's male privilege, there's this privilege and that privilege. So I wanted to alert readers to the possibility that we might be operating from a position of Muslim privilege, where we just assume things about life that don't hold true for people in our country who are not Muslim. And I use this story of this child, slum child, and my earlier novels were, I would say, quite influenced by Charles Dickens. I used to love Charles Dickens as a child and a teenager, and read a lot of his novels. And one of the ones I loved the most was Oliver Twist.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was very interested in this whole dynamic between the rich and the poor and what happens when they interact, because so much of our interactions are in bubbles and silos and restricted areas where we don't have much to do with people from different socioeconomic classes and backgrounds unless they are in positions of servitude to us.
Mm-hmm.
We are comfortable when somebody is working in our house as a domestic helper, but are we as comfortable when that same person is our equal in our schools or in our workplaces? And I think that's a question that we're coming to see today in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
But back in 2010, when I wrote this book, I think we were just not at all thinking about our privilege in terms of religion, class privilege, so on and so forth. So I think Slum Child was my not very subtle attempt at addressing those themes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always felt that, when Pakistanis especially talk about white privilege or apartheid, they seem to forget how they themselves practice social apartheid every single day of their lives in Pakistan if they happen to be in positions of power, regardless of religion.
It's a blind spot. It's definitely a blind spot. And we're told from the beginning that Islam as a religion, teaches us to treat minorities well, to treat this person like this and this person like this, and here are the rules and here are the conventions. So we develop a certain smugness that, we must be doing it right because we're Muslim, but we're not actually going any further than the bare minimum. And even when you are following the tenets, there are ways to still keep people in their place. And we really, really need to think very deeply about that as well.
I'm very uncomfortable with the word minorities.
What's a word that you like better?
Citizens. Everybody who is in a country is a citizen of that country, and no need to
Okay.
put labels on that person, you know?
Well, minorities are a practical way of talking about the demographics of our society. We are such a diverse country. We're so rich in ethnicities and languages and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, going back to our political system, where our budget, our federal budget, our provincial budget, are all divided up by these regions. Where do you live? How big is your population? What city are you in? How many people in this city are this ethnicity or that ethnicity? That affects all the budgetary decisions. So I think we've been conditioned to think in this way, and we sort of tend to make these mistakes by thinking that, okay, well, I live in Karachi, it has X amount of this and X amount of that, and 90% of us are this sect and 10% of us are another sect, and then there's a 10% that's not even from either sect. This is how we think as Pakistanis. This is how we are raised to identify ourselves, and it follows on from a tribalistic way of thinking about ourselves versus the other, the outsiders, the strangers.
Very much
So
so.
while while you're talking about citizens, but citizens implies equality, and we are looking at not just questions of equality but equity as well. And I think minority, it's a flawed term, but it's a useful placeholder for us to remember that not everybody is exactly like us. We're not a homogenous society. I think we need that reminder.
Okay. Again, I'm avoiding going into a long debate because I want to keep us on your novels and your writing with ventures on the side into political thinking and policy. Let's talk about the 786 CyberCafe, your second novel.
Okay, that's about, what year did I write that? My goodness, 2008 now, when the internet first came to Pakistan. And the internet was, the web was invented in 1999. I was very lucky to have access to it from my US days in college and graduate school, where, of course, the internet was a academic network. And then after some years, then it became commercial, and then it was opened to everybody, and anyone could get an email address and an internet account. And that revolution hit Pakistan in the middle of the decade, the first decade of the 2000s. And I was so intrigued by how this arrival of this technology was going to change and affect society, Pakistani society, especially middle-class society, which has access to education and computers, but its social mores are very conservative. So what kind of clash is going to happen when all of this converges? And in the most dynamic city in Pakistan, which is Karachi, the Karachi is hustle, hustle, hustle. And everybody is hungry to change, to improve, to learn more, to earn more. So I thought that was a fabulous backdrop for a comedic novel. So that's what the 786 CyberCafe is.
And I love the name of your first novel, Where They Dream in Blue.
Oh, yes. That title was so hard to come up with. I had a different title, and my editor at the time just said, I don't like this title. You must change it to something else. So I'm like, oh my God, now what? So I dug deep into the barrel of my very messy, crowded mind and came up with that title. And I think it's worked. It's held up over the years.
And would you want to talk a little bit about this novel?
Just to give you a very basic plot, it's about a Pakistani American who makes the journey not from Pakistan to America, but from America back to Pakistan in search of his roots. And I did not know that type of novel was going to get really popular, not the migration story, but the reverse migration story. So I wrote that novel a little bit ahead of its time. And again, I was very taken with Charles Dickens and the story of Oliver Twist. So there's a Dickensian element, a clash of classes and a clash of socioeconomic backgrounds also that happens against the backdrop of this very modern city and its very ancient Sufi myths and Sufi culture and Sufi heritage. And so that's modernity is clashing with mythology and fables and an ancient heritage. So again, a very rich cauldron in which to weave a personal story.
When you go back to this novel, do you feel that there's been your themes have changed dramatically?
My themes tend to stay the same. It's the writing that's become, I think, better. I'm hoping that I can get this and the 786 CyberCafe published with the Little Book Company again. So, sort of 20 years after.
We would love that.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to sort of revive those two in ebook format at least, so that they're not lost, because they've gone out of print.
And that's a pity, and that's a shared pain, I think, that many authors feel in Pakistan especially, that their books go out of print, and it's just a very painful experience. But we will republish these.
Inshallah, inshallah. I think we'll end on a really hopeful note that I've really enjoyed my experience with the Little Book Company in publishing the fruits of our own labor, and I look forward to doing more with you in the future.
Wonderful. We're not ending there. You hold on for a moment.
Okay.
Animal medicine. This was a book of short.
No, I don't think I want to go there. I think I'd like to stop with Where They Dream in Blue.
Oh, really? And
That book is completely inaccessible to the public, so I don't feel it's fair to talk about it and whet people's appetites, and then they can't get a hold of it.
And what about your collection of short stories that the Little Book Company has just published, The Fruits of Our Unlabor? Do you want to talk a little?
Yeah, that's an interesting collection. I mean, this is speculative fiction, so these are all sorts of weird tales, and some of them deal with mythical creatures, and some of them are horror stories, and some of them are. There's one that actually takes place in a space hotel in space. So these were stories where I really let my imagination go wild. Some of them have already been published, and some were unpublished. So I said, let's just put a collection together and release it for a local audience that can't get their hands on maybe an Amazon download or an Audible download. Let's try this. Because I think, you'd said the pain of going out of print and all that. Yeah, but there's also the joy of discovering new mediums as new technologies come out, and figuring out how you can adapt to that and make your work accessible to even more people in different places. It's more exciting than the pain of feeling that a novel has gone. You can always make it come back to life in a different incarnation.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like for me, the Little Book Company is all about that. And then this podcast is one step more. And, as we go forward, there'll be many more blocks to this. So I agree with you completely. And I wanted to ask you just before we go a little bit about, your own background, Bina, for those who might not know you. You grew up in the United States?
I had a childhood that was divided between the US and Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And when I say divided, I spent the first 5 years of my life growing up in the US, and then came back to Pakistan, but then kept going back to the US over summers for summer visits, and then went back to the US finally when I started college after I'd finished secondary school here in Pakistan, and lived in the US for another 6 years. And then finally made a permanent move back to Pakistan when I was 23. So that was, I would say that was significantly the end of my growing up. And when I reached Pakistan in 1995, that was the start of my adult life.
Mm-hmm. Was it difficult to make that transition from the US to Pakistan, particularly to Karachi?
Yeah, it was hard. It was very hard. It's not the city that we have today. It felt much more desolate. It felt very far away from a lot of the world. And I turned up here right as military rule began. So there was a concerted effort to keep the people unaware of what was happening in the outside world. The news was very restricted, and we had state television. There was a lot of control over information. So there was this feeling that we weren't really connected to the rest of the world in any meaningful way. We had no internet, of course, but we barely had television. The big deal was when VCRs came and we could watch all the taped shows from the US and the UK. That was exciting. That was really the start of, I would say, the information revolution in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Bina, I know that I've taken up almost an hour of your time, but before we go, before you sleep, is there anything that you're working on now? Are you working on a new novel? Any short stories that you're working on?
A collection of my nonfiction, that is the feminist writing that I've done, because we haven't talked at all about feminism, and that will also have to wait for another podcast. But I've done a significant amount of writing on the women's rights movement in Pakistan. And I decided that it was finally time to collate that material and try to get it published as a book. So I think I end my blog because at some point I will wind down the blog. So I think taking something away from that would be these essays and these pieces of writing based on my columns and my essays and the blogs. And it will be a nice sort of way to cap off that era in my writing life.
I think that's a great idea, and you're doing that now.
Well, I've got the manuscript, and it's gone to my agent, and she's going to have a read and then get back to me. Let me know what she thinks.
Wonderful. You said we haven't talked about feminism, and that
we won't have time to do it now. Absolutely not.
Comment I was going to make was that it came as a surprise to me that you said we haven't talked about feminism, because again, I don't separate that out for myself. I feel like everything I say is about feminism, but as I'm sure you feel as well, and I don't treat it as some sort of a separate category that we should be.
So I guess we could say we've been talking about feminism the whole hour, but we just didn't realize it.
I did.
Okay, good. I'm glad somebody was paying attention.
And we talked about the Monsoon War, and we talked about...
Oh, that's true. We talked about 2 novels that are very feminist in nature. That's true.
And when you hear this podcast, I think you'll realize we were doing it throughout. That was...
yeah, I'm sure. I'm blabbing, I don't know what I'm saying. So I'll go back and listen to it later.
Well, Bina, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful talking to you, and we'll do this again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.